All right, so in this video we're going to talk about how the hypothalamus, which is part of your diencephalon, how it really controls the master endocrine gland in your body, which is the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus controls the pituitary, which controls most other organs and endocrine glands in the human body. Now we call the hypothalamus then the master control center because it's really what's controlling the thing that controls most of your organs and tissues in your body. Now, if you all remember, the hypothalamus was located kind of on the inferior part of the diencephalon. It forms the inferior wall of the third ventricle, but it's attached to the pituitary directly by an infundibulum or stalk. Okay. Now, what happens is the way that the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland is it does this by releasing what are called regulatory hormones, or RH for short. We can also call these releasing hormones. So if the hormone in question in the name ends with RH, then you know it's a hormone of the hypothalamus, because neurons in the hypothalamus can actually make their own hormones, which then get sent into the bloodstream and can communicate with the pituitary gland. Now, the hypothalamus also creates inhibiting hormones, like these can be hormones that inhibit pituitary functions. Now, one thing that's different between the anterior and posterior parts of the pituitary gland is that the anterior pituitary gland is made of glandular tissue that's excited by hormones released by the hypothalamus itself. That differs from the posterior pituitary gland, which is made of neural tissue, and that basically is made of axons that extend from the hypothalamus and then synapse on blood vessels in the posterior pituitary. Now, under both circumstances, the hormones are made by the hypothalamus. Just the way they get to the pituitary is a little different, either through axons or through the bloodstream. And so what we're looking at here is basically zoomed in on a mid-sagittal view of the brain. So we can see on the inferior view of the brain here, we have the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary gland nearby, and what attaches the hypothalamus to the pituitary is the stalk, or infundibulum. We can see that the pituitary is divided into two parts. We got an anterior portion and a posterior portion. The anterior part of the pituitary gland is made of glandular tissue. So it's actually made of cells that are like of a gland. They're endocrine cells. The posterior pituitary is made of neural tissue. So it's actually made of axons of neurons extending from the hypothalamus down into the posterior pituitary. So these have different names then. We call the anterior pituitary also called the adenohypophysis, kind of like for gland, and the posterior pituitary gland is called the neurohypophysis, like for neural tissue. This little thing nearby, you guys, this is the optic chiasm. And going back to last chapter, we talked about how when the optic nerves come back, they connect together at the optic chiasm, which if you look here is really close to the pituitary gland. That this is clinically significant to talk about because primary pituitary tumors are actually fairly common. And a tumor of the pituitary gland can actually swell and impinge on the optic chiasm. So one of the first symptoms of a pituitary tumor are things like visual disturbance, where because the tumor is impinging on the optic chiasm, individuals actually have trouble being able to consciously see things, and that's going to be a sign of a pituitary tumor. Now, it turns out that the pituitary gland also directs the activities of your adrenal gland, and the adrenal gland sits atop the kidneys. We have a cortex and a medulla, and we'll talk about how the pituitary really controls the adrenal here in a little bit. Now, what this next slide talks about are basically the different hormones that are released by the hypothalamus. Now remember, the hypothalamus releases releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. So if your hormone name ends with RH or IH, that tells you immediately it's a hormone of the hypothalamus. So for instance, if I give you guys a name of a hormone called CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, well, if the hormone ends in RH, immediately you know it comes from the hypothalamus. Or if I told you guys there's another hormone called GnRH, or gonadotropin releasing hormone. Well, if it ends in RH, that comes from the hypothalamus then. Okay. We also have growth hormone inhibiting hormone, If it ends with IH, that also comes from the hypothalamus. And there's lots of different hormones released by the hypothalamus. Now, what's nice is that most of these hormones are named for the system that they're a part of. Okay, so if I told you guys that there are endocrine cells in the adrenal cortex, then we can kind of get a sense that corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, probably relates to the adrenal cortex, and it does. But what happens is that all of these releasing hormones, or regulatory hormones, they don't stimulate the endocrine cell directly. These hypothalamic hormones stimulate the pituitary, which then causes the release of other hormones that then stimulate endocrine organs or cells down the line. So really, when we're talking about the regulatory hormones released by the hypothalamus, they're just the ones that are going to influence the pituitary gland. That's it. And you can, if I go back to this last slide, you can see it's a very short distance of communication. So hormones released by the hypothalamus travel through blood vessels to the pituitary and then stimulate cells in the anterior pituitary to release additional hormones. So all of these hormones, corticotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, basically CRH, GnRH, and TRH, these are all hormones that stimulate additional hormones to be released by the anterior pituitary. So it's a very short distance of communication here. You might wonder, what's the point? Why do we have the hypothalamus putting in this extra step? Like, why would we want the hypothalamus to release a hormone that all it does is stimulate or inhibit the pituitary gland, which then releases another hormone? Well, it's all about control. It's all about redundancy and control. So that if the hypothalamus releases a hormone that's necessary to stimulate the pituitary gland, that's just an additional step that your body can control in this whole process of maintaining homeostasis. Okay. Now there are some inhibiting hormones as well, you guys, like growth hormone inhibiting hormone and prolactin inhibiting hormone. These are also regulatory hormones, but instead of having an excitatory effect on the pituitary, these things inhibit cells of the pituitary from releasing hormones. So for instance, growth hormone releasing hormone would stimulate the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone, whereas growth hormone inhibiting hormone would prevent the anterior pituitary from releasing growth hormone. You might wonder, well, why do we care about that? Well, growth hormone is a very potent hormone that can cause your bone and skeletal muscular tissue to grow pretty rapidly. If you have excesses in growth hormone being released, that can lead to overgrowth of skeletal tissues like bone and muscle. That can lead to diseases like gigantism or acromegaly, which we'll discuss a little bit today, but really go into more detail in pathophysiology. Now, remember, the pituitary gland sits right below the hypothalamus, and they're connected by an infundibulum or stalk. We have anterior and posterior lobes. So, again, we see that the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary. We have the anterior and posterior portions. The anterior portion is made of glandular tissue. The posterior portion is made of neural tissue, and it's housed in a bony cavity called the sella turcica, or Turkish saddle of the sphenoid bone. So that little sella turcica in the sphenoid bone, that's actually what houses the pituitary gland in there. So it actually sits in its own little bony cavity. Now, the anterior pituitary can be divided into several distinct anatomical regions. Don't worry about these, you guys. These actually won't come up in lecture today. But what's important to note is that the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary communicate through a series of blood vessels called the Hypothalamo-Hypophyseal portal system. And it sounds kind of wordy, but hypothalamo just means hypothalamus. Hypophyseal just means pituitary, because another word for the pituitary is the hypophysis. Okay? And a portal system is a system of blood vessels that interconnect. So this hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system is a series of blood vessels between the hypothalamus and the pituitary that interconnect and basically help transmit hormones from the hypothalamus to the pituitary. And they're very small blood vessels. These are actually what are called capillaries, which are the smallest blood vessels in your body, and they're going to help transport hormones from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. In fact, this is what the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system looks like. So we can find then that we got blood vessels here in the infundibulum, and those are connected to blood vessels in the anterior pituitary. Do you guys see how it goes from red to blue? Well, the red vessels here indicate that it's oxygenated blood, which typically is what is arterial blood. And the blue here indicates deoxygenated blood, which is typically venous blood. So by looking at this picture, we can assume then that the direction of blood flow is down from red to blue, or basically oxygenated to deoxygenated. So we want to carry blood from this area down to the anterior pituitary because that's where those hormones need to travel. Like, we need to have the regulatory hormones released by the hypothalamus get inside of this portal system and then travel through the bloodstream to the anterior pituitary, where those hormones can leave the bloodstream and then excite the glandular cells of the anterior pituitary. Now, this differs from the posterior pituitary, because if you look closely here, you'll see then that these blood vessels do not connect with blood vessels of the hypothalamus. Because what happens is that with the posterior pituitary, it's not really involving communication of hormones between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Instead, what happens is that hormones are made by the hypothalamus. They're transported through axons down the infundibulum to the posterior pituitary, and then those hormones are synapsed directly into the bloodstream of the posterior pituitary. Okay? So there's no regulatory hormone communication between the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary. There's only regulatory hormone communication between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and that communication is mediated by the Hypothalamo-Hypophyseal portal system, which is a series of blood vessels here between the hypothalamus and pituitary. Now, some of the hormones that are released by your anterior pituitary include things like thyroid-stimulating hormone, prolactin, adrenocorticotropin hormone, growth hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and melanocyte-stimulating hormone. What's nice about these hormones is they're often named for exactly what they do. So thyroid-stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland. Prolactin stimulates mechanisms involved in lactation. Make sense? Adrenocorticotropin hormone affects cells of the adrenal cortex. Growth hormone causes growth of skeletal tissues throughout your body. Follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, these influence mechanisms in your gonads in both males and females. So like in the testes and the ovaries. Testes and ovaries are stimulated by FSH and LH in both males and females. But they're named for the female processes because there are follicles in the ovaries and there's something called corpus luteum in the ovaries. And so the way that these hormones got their name is through the female processes that they stimulate. But you also find these same hormones in males, and they do influence the formation of different things by the testes. Now, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, or MSH, guess what? This stimulates melanocytes, and melanocytes make melanin, which is this skin pigmentation you can find. Makes your skin darker. So what we find here, guys, is just a summary of the hormones released by the anterior pituitary gland. So we've got thyroid-stimulating hormone, prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, growth hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and melanocyte-stimulating hormone. You might wonder, well, what stimulates these hormones to be released by the anterior pituitary? Well, guess what? It's the regulatory hormones in the hypothalamus. So the releasing hormones like TRH, prolactin releasing factor, gonadotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, or growth hormone releasing hormone, all of these hormones released by the hypothalamus make it into the hypophyseal portal system, and then that basically stimulates cells in the anterior pituitary to release these hormones that have effects on these target tissues. So you might wonder then, well, what stimulates the anterior pituitary to release thyroid-stimulating hormone? Well, it's thyroid-releasing hormone. So the hypothalamus will release thyroid-releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to release thyroid-stimulating hormone. the anterior pituitary then can stimulate the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Okay, that's its effect. You might wonder then, well, how does the hypothalamus communicate then with the adrenal cortex? Well, the hypothalamus can release corticotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, and that stimulates the adrenal cortex to release its hormones respectively. So it's a big chain of hormones in this process, where the hypothalamus releases regulatory hormones, which can influence the anterior pituitary, which can influence a variety of target tissues. Okay? Now, it turns out that things like follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are both stimulated by GnRH, which is released by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone. When you think gonads, think like reproductive system. So if it's gonadotropin-releasing hormone, that's going to stimulate the release of FSH and LH, which influence the gonads like your testes and ovaries. Okay? Now, the posterior pituitary is a completely different process. And it's kind of odd here, where the posterior pituitary is actually derived from neural tissue. So it's not actually a glandular tissue. It's actually made of nervous tissue. Because really the posterior pituitary is made of just bundles of axons. So the posterior pituitary is just a big tract of axons that can synapse on blood vessels in the posterior pituitary. So what we have here then is something called the Hypothalamo-Hypophyseal Tract, not a portal system, a Hypothalamo-Hypophyseal Tract. Remember, a tract is a bundle of axons in the central nervous system. So what this looks like then is we have neuron cell bodies in the hypothalamus, like the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus. Their axons are going to extend down the infundibulum straight into the posterior pituitary, where these axons will synapse directly on the blood vessels in the posterior pituitary. So this process doesn't involve regulatory hormones by the hypothalamus. There's only one hormone in this whole chain of events, and that's the hormone that's made by these hypothalamic nuclei. It's transported in vesicles down the axon and then synapsed, when appropriate, into the blood vessels of the posterior pituitary. So it's not as though there's regulatory hormones exciting these neurons. It's just one hormone in this process. And that differs from the anterior pituitary, because we had the regulatory hormones released by the hypothalamus that stimulate the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is where you just have neurons from the hypothalamus extending down directly into the posterior pituitary and just releasing their hormones directly into the bloodstream. One hormone in this process, okay? Not two, just one. So it turns out that this paraventricular nucleus makes oxytocin. The supraoptic nucleus makes antidiuretic hormone. Now, what these next slides show is basically a table of hormones released by the anterior and posterior pituitary glands and the effects of each hormone. Now, adrenocorticotropic hormone, remember in its name it sounds like the adrenal glands. Well, adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates cells of the adrenal cortex to release their hormones. Okay, that's basically its effect. And what stimulates adrenocorticotropin releasing hormone is, what stimulates adrenocorticotropic hormone is corticotropin releasing hormone released by the hypothalamus, which stimulates ACTH to be released by the anterior pituitary. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex directly. Now, if you lack adrenocorticotropic hormone, what you end up with then is something called Addison's disease. Addison's disease is adrenal cortex insufficiency, where you don't release enough adrenal cortex hormones, and there's a variety of effects on your body that come about as a result. Okay? Now, hypersecretion of ACTH leads to something called Cushing's syndrome, which is an oversecretion of adrenal cortex hormones, and that leads to a variety of effects on your body. Now, the effects of these syndromes or diseases we'll talk about in pathophysiology, but what I want you guys to know for now is just what disease results from each hyposecretion or hypersecretion. So if you don't have enough ACTH, so if you have hyposecretion of ACTH, then you can't stimulate the adrenal cortex to release its hormones, so you have adrenocortical insufficiency, that's Addison's disease, okay? Or if you have hypersecretion of ACTH, then you get way too much adrenal cortex being released by, hormones being released by the adrenal cortex, and that leads to Cushing's syndrome, okay? Now, things like follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone basically influence the gonads, okay? So it's GnRH, or gonadotropin-releasing hormone, released by the hypothalamus, that stimulates FSH and LH to be released by the anterior pituitary. And this process works in both males and females. Now, if you get a hyposecretion of FSH and LH, what you'll find then is in females, basically menstrual problems, and in males and females, possibly infertility. Okay? If you get a hypersecretion of FSH and LH in males and females, what you might end up with is hypergonadism, so basically just really large gonads, lots of sex hormones being released, so even more exaggerated secondary sex characteristics. But in both males and females, you might find precocious puberty, which is basically puberty with a more early onset. So you guys maybe have heard of girls or boys who undergo puberty at like 8 years old. Okay, that can happen. We call that precocious puberty. It's happening earlier than sort of the average, and that can be caused by hormonal disturbance, like hypersecretion of FSH and LH. Thyroid stimulating hormone is what stimulates the thyroid, and what stimulates the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone is basically thyroid releasing hormone, or TRH. So the hypothalamus releases TRH. That causes TSH to be released by the anterior pituitary, and that all it does is stimulate the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. So it's a very simple effect here. It's even in the name, thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, if you have a hyposecretion of thyroid stimulating hormone, then you'll have hypothyroidism, or basically just low thyroid hormone levels. Or if you have a hypersecretion of thyroid stimulating hormone, that can lead to hyperthyroidism, which is basically too high of thyroid hormone levels. Now, one form of hyperthyroidism that we'll talk about in pathophysiology is called Graves' disease. And Graves' disease is an autoimmune disease that causes something that replicates hypersecretion of TSH. So it's not TSH directly, but it's actually your immune system that mimics TSH, and it causes hypersecretion of thyroid hormone as a result. So we call that hyperthyroidism. So prolactin, we talked about, is being involved with basically helping with lactation. And what you find then is that if prolactin is lacking, you can see things like menstrual irregularities in females, or difficulty with producing milk, like breast milk. And in males, what happens is that low prolactin levels cause infertility, and high prolactin levels cause impotence, or just difficulty with arousal, that kind of stuff. Now, remember, growth hormones released by the anterior pituitary. It basically stimulates growth of skeletal tissues throughout your body, like bone, muscle, and adipose. And if you have hyposecretion of growth hormone, then you're not going to have basically development of those tissues. So that can lead to things like dwarfism. Okay. Otherwise, if you have hypersecretion of growth hormone, that can lead to gigantism, where you could be like 9 feet tall. Or if you get excessive release of growth hormone in adulthood, that can cause acromegaly, where your bones can't really grow larger because you're already done growing lengthwise, but your cartilage gets bigger and your bones can become thicker. And we'll talk more about these diseases in pathophysiology. Okay. Now, by the posterior pituitary, we have things like vasopressin and oxytocin. Vasopressin is also called antidiuretic hormone, and it has a variety of different effects. One of the effects of antidiuretic hormone, as released by your posterior pituitary gland, is it stimulates the kidneys to reabsorb more water. Okay, so if you stimulate your kidneys to reabsorb more water, then you prevent urine formation, and you're basically holding on to water better, because water loss is called diuresis. So if anti-diuretic hormone prevents diuresis, it basically prevents water loss. So anti-diuretic hormone stimulates your kidneys to hold on to water. And by holding on to water, you actually can maintain your blood pressure. So let's say if your blood pressure were low, or because you're dehydrated, you could release a lot of anti-diuretic hormone to hold on to your water better instead of losing it through urine, and that can keep your blood pressure up. But we'll talk more about that later on. Now, anti-diuretic hormone is also called vasopressin because it actually causes vasoconstriction. It kind of presses down on your blood vessels. Not the hormone, but it causes your blood vessels to kind of press, like vasopressin. And vasoconstriction increases blood pressure. So anti-diuretic hormone can increase blood pressure by two different mechanisms. It can allow you to retain water, which increases blood pressure. It can also cause vasoconstriction, which increases blood pressure. Okay? That's released by the posterior pituitary gland. Now, oxytocin we call the love hormone or pair bonding hormone. Oxytocin is released during forming social relationships and that kind of stuff, but it's also released during labor and breastfeeding. And what's weird too is it's also a stress hormone, so it's also released during periods of very high stress. But they call this the pair bonding hormone because it's a hormone that's related to helping us feel happy and helping us form close relationships. Now, some of its other effects on the body include things like uterine contractions, so it causes the uterus to contract. So if you want to stimulate labor, like in a maternity ward, then basically you can put someone on an oxytocin drip, which can cause their uterus to start contracting. Or oxytocin is also necessary for milk letdown, so it's involved in lactation. So let's say if a mother is having difficulty producing breast milk, they might give her oxytocin supplements, which can increase breast milk secretion.